communion with my Lord, hearing His voice in every line, making each faithful saying mine. More about Jesus, more about Jesus, more of His saving fullness see, more of His love who died for me.
Continuing our study in the book of Acts, we left off when the Holy Spirit has at last come upon specifically the 12 apostles. And each of them heard the apostles speaking in their own language, and that is the meaning of tongues. So now we pick up in the response to this event. We already saw in verse 12 that they all continued in astonishment and great perplexity, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But there is naturally another group of people here in verse 13. Now, not to distinguish this from that same group, but simply in the text, there is a different response. So it's a different group in terms of their response, but we acknowledge that it is in that same crowd, in that same place. And they say in verse 13, you see there, but others mocking were saying they are full of new wine. Now, if you're like me when you read this, the first thing you might note is that this is a little bit odd because it doesn't seem to answer the dilemma that is before them. The dilemma that is before them is that a miracle is taking place and each person could hear the word preached in their own language, even though these 12 men were from Galilee. And saying that they are full of wine, they are drunk, doesn't explain what is going on before them. But it should be noted that the word mocking, when we could do a study of all the times that is used in even just the New Testament, and it doesn't have to mean that something logically is being followed. Someone can mock and they're responding to something. It doesn't mean it logically makes sense. It just means that they're mocking, dismissing it, denying, speaking against it, and they're not going to accept what has happened. Instead, they're going to choose to mock it. So the explanation of the miracle does not need to make sense. They are mocking. However, when we put this in a real life setting, we would be somewhat curious as to why, of all the responses, this would be the response. They are full of wine. We know that they don't have to say something logical, but we would expect them not to make sure they have a logistic argument and it all checks out, but we would expect them to come up with something that at least made some kind of sense, that would be something they could say in response to the miracle. So when they say they are full of wine, this isn't really a satisfactory response. If they are saying that the apostles are full of wine, that doesn't explain why all of the crowd is understanding the language that they are speaking. In fact, we would be totally surprised that this is even a response. We would say that doesn't answer anything. It's not what we would expect. Not that it has to make perfect logical sense, but it's not even what we would naturally expect because it doesn't even seem to address what is going on. Now, that being said, you have there, back in Acts chapter 2, there in verse 8, how do we hear them in our own language? That's talking about the apostles. Verse 6, when the sound occurred, the multitude came together and were bewildered because each of them was hearing them speak in his own language. So them there referring to the apostles again, and you just go along down the line. And so in the text, it is constantly referring to the apostles speaking these languages. And so I think a scholar or the consensus of people who study this text, who understand the grammar, they would say that in verse 13, the they must refer to the apostles because it's naturally it's naturally what would follow in the text. They're talking about the apostles up until that point. They refers to the apostles, and since verse 13 is so close to those other verses, therefore they must be accusing the apostles of being drunk. Unless, however, we can find a textual reason to believe that that would not be the case. If the grammar flows and the text is naturally pointing to the apostles, to the people saying that the apostles are drunk, then that would be the most natural interpretation. But what if we kept reading and we said, maybe they're accusing others of being drunk? Is there any reason further down the line to believe that? I think it's worth investigating. For example, verse 14. But Peter, taking his stand with the 11, raised his voice and declared to them, Men of Judea, and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and give heed to my words. So Peter taking his stand with the 11. Let's keep that in mind, because taking his stand, he's grouped in with the 11 apostles. And so when he starts speaking, it's Peter and the 11, and then the crowd. Peter and the 11 are the group that are together. They're responding together. They're in unison. They're in unity. And now they're responding to the group, the other group, which is the crowd. So we have to see how this naturally fits. In the very next verse, for these men are not drunk as you suppose, for it is the third hour of the day. So Peter, taking a stand with the 11, says, these men are not drunk as you suppose. So the trouble is that if Peter is speaking with the apostles as one group, it wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make as much sense for him to say, these men are not drunk as you suppose. Now, in a real life setting, he could be. Say the 11 are standing behind him, and he's still in unison with them. And he says, these men, these 11, they're not drunk as you suppose. But see, Peter is included in that group. So the most natural response that we would expect him to say would be, we are not drunk, because they're responding as one unified group, and Peter's along with them. Now, Greek is a little bit different than English. It does not have to be that way. He could be part of the same group, but because of what he's arguing, he could be referring to the apostles still when he says these men. But it's not really the most natural thing that we would expect. He's with the 11 apostles. He's in that group. The crowd is supposedly accusing them of being drunk, if that's what is going on here. And when Peter responds, the most natural thing we would expect is, we are not drunk. He's totally capable of saying it that way. And so instead, we kind of have a mixed group. Peter, then the 11 apostles, then the group. But why not just say, we are not drunk as you suppose? Again, that doesn't prove that when the original men say they're drunk, it doesn't prove that they're not talking about the apostles. They could still be. But let's keep looking in the text. Basically, what we're trying to find out is, when they say, these men are drunk, they are filled with new wine, who are they talking about? Are they talking about the apostles? Are they talking about the people who are amazed and perplexed? Well, again, we can't say for sure that it's not the apostles, but again, we are seeing some we are seeing some things in the text where we'd say that's not what we would expect. That doesn't seem natural either. So these men are not drunk as you suppose, okay? For it is the third hour of the day. Then you drop down and you just keep, you go through his argumentation. We're going to get to his sermon again in another video and the point he's making. But drop down to verse 32, and again Peter says, this Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Now I understand that there's different ways of wording things. Just because he says these men in verse 15 does not mean that he can't say we in verse 32. The point could be in verse 15, he's arguing and making a defense that these men, the general group of the apostles, are not drunk. And in verse 32, he is including the apostles as a group as a whole. And this time, though, he's talking about a separate thing, that they're witnesses of the resurrection. That is totally possible, but it's not what you would expect. Because in both cases, in Peter's answer to these people, the apostles are one group, and Peter is part of them, and he's answering. So why would he say these men are not drunk in verse 15, but in verse 32, referring to that same group, which includes himself, he says that this Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Unless the we is referring to all of them there. But it's not likely, because as we see in Acts chapter 1, the witnesses specifically refers to the apostles. Acts chapter 1 verse 8. But you, the apostles, we've kind of gone over this already. You, Jesus tells them, will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and even to the ends of the earth. So apostle means one who is sent out, an envoy, an ambassador. He's bringing a message to preach. But at the same time, it is just as accurate to define the apostles as the witnesses of Jesus, because that is what they are called and that is who they are. So it becomes clear that in chapter 2, in verse, in verse 32, we are all witnesses. He's referring to the same group, the apostles. That is the most reasonable, natural, logical thing we can make of it. So, grammatically, not impossible. Textually, not impossible. He could be saying they earlier on, these men, and then later on, he could be saying we. But the fact of the matter is, it's not what you would expect, and it doesn't seem natural. He's standing with the 11. He's included with them. You have two natural groups, Peter and the apostles and the crowd. And Peter says, these men are not drunk. But referring to the same group and speaking for the same group, later on he says, we are all witnesses. Why would there be that change? Now, what is more logical? What is more reasonable? Again, they're mocking. They're saying these men are drunk. So they don't have to be giving a logical argument like a logician, a debater. They can be just saying something that doesn't make much sense at all and just dismissing it, denying it. But we would expect at least their response to address what is going on. They're seeing a miracle. These men are filled with wine doesn't explain that. So, is it more logical for the people to say the apostles are filled with wine, they're drunk? Or would it make more sense if they were instead saying these men, the ones in chapter 2, verse 12, where it says, they all continued in astonishment and great perplexity, saying to one another, what does this mean? Maybe the others are saying they are filled with wine. And that is not a bad or unnatural jump in the text, because you have verse 12, they all continued in astonishment. And then in verse 13, others mocking were saying they are full of new wine. So you have they in verse 12 not referring to the apostles. And then you have they in verse 13, and that may not refer to the apostles either. So it's not an unnatural jump in the text. It very well could be. And if you want my honest take on it, it makes more sense if they're saying these guys who are perplexed, they're just drunk. They think they're hearing the apostles preach in their language. That's what they think. But they're drunk. So these guys are filled with wine. Don't take what they're saying seriously. It's not a miracle. That logically makes more sense without it having to be this debater, logical, someone like a logician. It's not this sophisticated logical answer. It's a simple answer. It doesn't have to be. But it makes more sense if they're saying that those people, they're all perplexed. They're saying, how are we hearing it in our own language? But they're only saying that because they're drunk. They're not speaking in their language, and therefore they would still be mocking, because they themselves can hear the apostles are preaching in their language. But they're going to deny it themselves because they don't want to believe it. And their excuse is going to be, you guys are just drunk. Now, is that the consensus? No. Most people say they're accusing the apostles of being drunk. Is that without problems? No. We don't have a clear answer in the text. Is that what most people who know the grammar and the language would say? I would say most people traditionally have said it's the apostles who are accused of being drunk. But in my mind, it makes the most sense if they are saying that the people who are amazed at this are drunk. And that's why they think the apostles are speaking miraculously in their own language. Because there you have a divide. Just like we see in the Gospels. Those who were accepting the word and those who were rejecting the word. Those who were accepting it was a miracle, and those who were denying that it was a miracle. And so you have the same thing when Jesus did miracles and taught, and you have the same thing with the apostles, that division of two groups. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing here. But anyways, that's an interesting thing to look at. Again, we want to study as much as we can in the book of Acts. And sometimes that means we're going to chase those interesting studies and to try and understand them. But in the next video, we'll get down to the business and see what was Peter's sermon about and what was he trying to say about Jesus. So don't miss that next time.